All right. Thank you for all of you who stuck around for the afternoon of the second day of the conference. We actually have a really great lineup for the next few panels, so I think you'll be happy that you stayed here. The topic of this afternoon is the U.S. utility solar market. And when we were designing the agenda for this conference, we realized we had basically 4 themes that we could cover with the time that was allotted. And we had to pick what they were going to be, and we tried at first to fit the utility market into one of the other buckets somewhere within navigating, financing. It obviously relates to a bunch of different things, but we found that there's so much discussion around the utility market in the U.S. and so much to talk about that is unique to that market that we decided to make it a segment in and of itself. And so that's what we're at the beginning of here. So I'll provide a bit of an introduction on where we stand in the utility market in the U.S. right now. Then we have a few great panels. We have a visionary roundtable that's going to be kind of a wide, broad look at the state of the market now and some of the upcoming barriers that we might face. We have a project developer roundtable, purely developers looking at what's going on in their market now. We have a utility viewpoint panel, which is just utilities talking about their side of the picture. And then we have a panel that talks about the technologies we haven't yet covered at this conference, CSP and CPV, and what future they have in the U.S. market. It's been a rapidly changing year for CSP technology and CPV to an extent as well. So with that, let me just dive right in. Today is day 68 after Solyndra. And the saga continues. Secretary Chu testified this morning in Congress to talk about his role in it. And so the story isn't over, and it's impacting every part of the market, not least of which is the utility market. But from now on, I'm just putting that in all of my slides, so it's not related. So where do we sit in the utility market in the U.S.? We maintain a database of every operating, contracted, and most pre-contract utility projects in the U.S. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about kind of feeds out of that, because there's a lot of things you can glean from both the projects that have been completed and then the pipeline that is supposed to get completed in the next few years. I should note that what I'm going to be talking about is going to be specific to PV and CPV. So when we cover CSP later this afternoon, that's separate numbers. With that, here's where we stand. We have 770 megawatts currently operating in the U.S. on the utility side of the meter in total. That's aggregate. So now we're hitting the point where our total operating capacity of utility PV is a relatively good month in Germany, whereas I used to say it was a bad month in Germany. But it's still pretty early days. And I presented early yesterday with the latest numbers on the Q3 in the U.S. We had about 200 megawatts connected just in Q3. So that number has been leaping upward, but it's still pretty small. That's in contrast to over 9 gigawatts of projects that have PPAs between developers and utilities, or are going to be developed by utilities, and have not yet been completed. Some of those are in construction. There are about 700 megawatts of projects with near-term completion in construction, plus another couple gigawatts of very large projects that are in construction. And that definition is going to start to get trickier as we hit this, coming up against the potential expiration of the cash grant. But there are 9 gigawatts of that. That's an enormous number. And those projects are expected to be completed generally in the 2013 to 2015 timeframe. So if we were actually to work through that entire pipeline and all of those projects were to get developed, we're talking about a huge market in a very short period of time. And that's not even accounting for the 25 plus gigawatts of projects that we track, where in this case I'll freely admit that there's no way this is comprehensive. That have been announced and don't yet have PPAs. If you were to add up all of the interconnection queues as well, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, you'd probably have 40 or 50 gigawatts in there. So the pipeline is huge, and there's been this big sort of land grab amongst developers to lock up site leases to start to get their projects permitted, to get them in the interconnection queues. And as a result, we have far more capacity that could be developed over the next few years than there's actually going to be demand for it. And fundamentally, that's kind of a theme that I want to permeate through everything that I'm talking about here. We have an oversupply of modules globally, but we definitely have an oversupply of projects in the US. Just looking at that in another way, this is when these projects announced that they were expected to be completed. This is just the contracted projects with a PPA. And the story I think that I really wanted to tell here is not so much about the out years, because in the end, the numbers for how much is expected to be completed in 2014, that's going to change on a weekly basis depending on any given project. But there are still almost 700 megawatts of projects. These are those that have not yet been completed. 700 megawatts of projects that expected to be completed in 2011 and are not yet complete. And we're 7 weeks out from the end of the year. A lot of these projects are in construction now. And so, as I mentioned yesterday morning, a big part of the total number for the US market at the end of this year is going to be determined by construction timelines on a bunch of these projects. But you also have this huge pipeline, anything from 2012 to even 2015 for larger projects that could potentially be trying to safe harbor product right now to qualify for the cash grant. So, there's this interesting dynamic going on right now at the end of this year of purchasing or safe harboring just to qualify for the cash grant and then hope that the project moves forward. Fundamentally, this gets at what I was talking about before. There's not only an oversupply of projects, there's an oversupply of developers. And some of you have probably seen this slide before, but we update it all the time, so it's new. Basically, this is a taxonomy we maintain of US utility PV project developers. It's not completely comprehensive. It doesn't include everyone, but I think it does include most of the big players. And it's worth kind of walking through it briefly, because I think it gives a pretty good picture of the landscape for project development in the US right now. So the way that we do this is we classify any given developer according to a series of categories. Starting with the top, you have European PV developers that have been developing projects in France and Italy and Spain and Germany for generally a number of years. They probably have more megawatts of solar in the ground than anybody else on this list. And they are either recognizing that Europe is starting to tail off in terms of new growth, or they just view the US as a strategic growth opportunity. And so they enter the US market and start to develop projects here. For many of these developers, they get in and they realize that the US market is a completely different beast than Europe is. It's much more difficult to develop projects. It's more difficult to finance projects. And the timeline on a project is much slower. And so we've had a bunch of conversations with developers that have recently entered the US market and said that their board expected them to have a multi-hundred megawatt pipeline in place with contracts 6 months down the line after entering the market, and it just doesn't work that way. So for some of these developers, they've actually had a lot of success. UE has completed a few projects. Belectric, which is part of Beck, and we have a speaker pretty soon from Belectric, has come a long way with some of their projects. So there's a few of these that have had a lot of success, but it is generally a wake-up call to enter the US market if you're a European developer. Moving down from that, pure play developers. This is the list that is probably the least comprehensive, because a past couple of years, I think there was a situation when it was recognized widely that the US utility market was going to grow a lot. It was recognized that there was opportunity and there weren't that many developers out there at first. And as I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, there was a lot of M&A going on. There were a lot of acquisitions of developers at relatively high prices. And so there was plenty of motivation for new companies to enter the market. And many of these were not traditionally utility PV developers. They may have just raised venture capital and started a business from scratch, or they may have been commercial integrators and developers that wanted to scale up to the utility market. And this is where there are dozens and dozens, and we hear about more of them all the time. Some of them are completely viable, but it's difficult for financiers, for suppliers, for EPCs to figure out which ones are real and which ones are not. Moving down from that, you have a bunch of joint ventures. These are of various types. In some cases, you have suppliers that are JVing with developers, and a good example of that is Wanzhong, which is a Chinese module supplier partnering with New Generation Power on, I think it's a 63 megawatt project in Illinois. And then you have a bunch of other types of these. And that's, I think, an increasing trend. We're forced to add more and more JVs to this list all the time, and it's making it hard to fit it on one slide. Then if you move to the right, we've got the sort of traditional energy entrants, we call them. At the top there, utility affiliates. These are generally IPPs that share a parent company with a utility. So PSEG, Duke, Sempra Generation, which is attached to SDG&E, and FPL, or now through NextEra, which we actually also have below. And then a bunch of IPPs. And actually, this is maybe in my mind one of the more meaningful groups of entrants here. The fact that we have companies like NRG and LS Power and Element Power and AES and all these NextEra, these companies that have been developing, completing, owning, and operating utility scale projects before, be they wind, be they natural gas, coal, whatever. The fact that they see the solar market now as meaningful enough, with enough volume and real enough that they're serious about it, is a good sign ultimately, though it is, they have some inherent advantages that make it more difficult for some other developers to compete. And then finally, looking at the left side of the screen there, we have the vertically integrated manufacturers, suppliers generally of modules who are in one way or another involved in project development. And so if you were to look at the pipeline, which I'll do in a minute, this is where the bulk of it lies right now, but that's really a function of two companies, First Solar and SunPower, both of which acquired developers a few years ago, both of which have the largest pipelines in the US still by a fair margin, and both of which are working through those pipelines now. But they used to be kind of the only ones, and they're not anymore. Solon develops projects, though they no longer manufacture in the US. Sharp acquired Recurrent Energy, which I should note that Recurrent has been very clear since the beginning that this wasn't a vertical integration play, and it's turned out generally to be true. There is a serious division between Sharp Solar and Recurrent. But then there are a bunch of others. MEMC acquired Sun Edison, which then acquired FRV and Axio Power. So we have a bunch that have gotten wrapped up together there. OCI, which is a polysilicon manufacturer, acquired Cornerstone and now has OCI Solar Power. LDK acquired Solar Power Inc., which was kind of a commercial developer and scaled up. And Hanwha Solar One has Solar Monkey, GCL is developing projects, Trina is developing projects, Canadian is at least looking at developing projects and potentially financing them. This is one of the bigger trends in the utility market in the US over the past couple of years. Basically every module supplier is looking at these pipelines, seeing that a fair amount of them are captive, that one of their competitors has definite access to parts of the pipeline through a project development arm or a JV or something like that, and then saying, if I want to play in this market, maybe I have to do something similar. And I'll get to in just a little bit what their options may be there. As I said, though, the pipeline, despite there being a lot of players out there, the pipeline itself is pretty concentrated. This is looking at contracted projects with a PPA, by developer, and this is in megawatts DC, which is why you probably see the numbers, for example, for First Solar a little different than what they report, because they generally report in AC. First Solar and SunPower together, over 40% of the pipeline contracted. And then you have a few others that have relatively large pipelines as well. Sun Edison, now that you've included FRV and Axio in there, NRG has made big moves. You see now we get down to the next few, and those are all IPPs, NRG, Sempra, Tenaska, and then Recurrent and Soitec, which is a CPV pipeline. So again, the point there is we have a lot of developers out there, a lot of projects that they're trying to push forward, and relatively few who have projects in the late stages. As I said before, we've had a lot of acquisitions. We've had well over $2 billion in M&A activity just in the utility market in the US, and it dates back a few years. If I was to go even a little bit further back, because I'm missing the first big acquisition, which was SunPower acquiring Powerlight back in 2007 or 2008. Since then, each year we've had 5 or 6 acquisitions, either of developers or of relatively large project pipelines, a number of which have been just this year. And there are a lot of other developers out there that could still be acquired. Many of them will tell you that they're not looking to be acquired, but particularly now when they're in a position with a lot of projects in the queue that they either have to run up against interconnection deposits or they have to win PPAs for, and it doesn't look too easy, or financing is tight, particularly in a post-1603 world if we end up there, then they're going to have to revisit that idea. And so then the question is, who's going to get acquired next? And this is a kind of a complicated chart, but the idea is, if you look at the left side, this is acquisitions that have already taken place. If you look at the bottom right, these are developers, not all of them, just some selected. And the top right, companies that theoretically could acquire. There are actually a lot more than that, right? I haven't listed all of them, but potential acquirers. I think that the main thing that I'll call right now, because we've been calling this for a while, and I don't know if Declan is still here, so maybe I shouldn't make this call, but Lincoln Renewable Energy, I'll say on the spot now, I think might be a good next target. This company's with a late-stage pipeline that have proven that they can execute on some of it at least, that may end up having to spend more money than they currently have, and if they have financing difficulties, then they may be a good target for somebody who wants a captive pipeline. I thought this would be interesting. We looked at the PJM queue. So for those of you who don't know, this PJM is the independent system operator for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, a couple other states. And we looked at the interconnection queue there. We looked at how big it was in any given state, how many projects are active in the queue, and then who holds those projects. The reason we did PJM, for example, and not California is that we figured out a way to hack it and figure out who the developer was for PJM. I would love to do it for California. So if anyone knows how afterwards, please tell me. But just looking at PJM, I do think it's a microcosm of the utility market in general. It gets at kind of the broad point that I wanted to make, which is that it's really clogged. It's easy to get a project in the interconnection queue. And as I was speaking with somebody a bit earlier, the problem is interconnection queues historically were based on the idea of big centralized power plants. There weren't that many of them. And then we had this situation where all of a sudden we have these sort of large distributed solar projects that are jumping into the interconnection queues in many, many more numbers than these queues are used to seeing, and then the people who are supposed to go through these applications are really ready for. And so the queues have gotten very clogged, and PJM is no exception there. We have 1.6 gigawatts active in the queue in New Jersey as of, I think this is 2 or 3 weeks ago. That's a huge number for the New Jersey market. To be sure, most of that will never get developed, but it's clogging up the queue. Pennsylvania still has 667 megawatts, and there was a conversation yesterday about the Pennsylvania SREC market. If you were paying attention to that, you know that I'd be surprised if 10% of that gets done in the next couple of years in Pennsylvania. And so, but it's in there. It hasn't been withdrawn. And then if you look at the right side of this, you're looking at the developers who hold those queue positions. This isn't breaking it down by where they are in the queue, so that's an important point. But just looking at overall active queue, one thing that's interesting there is that if you look at these names, many of them are not the names that potentially, or they're not the names that are generally considered to be the most active or the most successful developers yet in the U.S. solar market. These are, in some cases, entirely new entrants. In other cases, they've been developing wind projects and now they're doing solar, but they haven't announced much. So, I think it's interesting to see that even my taxonomy slide is missing 2/3 of these guys. There are an enormous number of developers out there that are active and have queue positions at a minimum, but are probably out there trying to get off-take agreements, trying to finance projects, potentially trying to safe harbor product for the cash grant. Just looking at it on a state-by-state basis, where does this pipeline sit? Again, this is the contracted pipeline. I didn't want to show California on the same scale because you wouldn't actually be able to recognize any of the other states, because California is still far and away holding the majority of the pipeline. We have over 6 gigawatts in the pipeline in California of contracted projects. The next nearest state is Arizona at under 800 megawatts. So we're still very California-centric. And that has played out in a number of ways, but one of them is that bidding for contracts in California is extraordinarily competitive. You always have hundreds and hundreds of bids on any utility RFO, as we know from the last cycle that we just went through. And as a result, you end up with really low PPA prices. And this is another theme that we're going to be talking about in a couple of the next sessions is to what extent are these bid prices really tenable? What are the assumptions that you have to make in your project pro forma in order for these projects to pencil out? And is it reasonable for you to be making those assumptions? I will say that I was saying the same thing a year and a half ago about the pipeline that is supposed to be closing financing now, saying, in order for this to work, module prices would have to be like $1.10. Well, here we are, and module prices are $1.10. So, there's an argument to make that we've been saying for a couple of years, PPA prices are too low. Maybe we've just been underestimating how low module prices can go. And then the question is, what are all the other assumptions you made? What are the debt terms you assumed? Is that reasonable? And so that's a conversation I think we can have on some of the next couple of sessions. I mentioned this before. If you are a module supplier and you're trying to access the utility market, there are a bunch of options that are available to you. There are actually more than I have here, but I thought this would be an interesting way to just kind of briefly look at it. Fundamentally, you can fully vertically integrate downstream. So you can acquire a project developer, you can just hire people to develop projects for you. You can go out there and start from greenfields and try to win PPAs and develop projects. Or you can buy up project pipelines and then use your internal project development team to move those through to completion. First Solar and SunPower have been enormously successful in that regard. And so I think there's an argument to make that makes sense. You see GCL doing that now, developing projects in the U.S., both through a JV with Solar Reserve and then on their own. And Trina's out there bidding on projects as well. You can do a kind of semi-vertical integration play, which is kind of a hedge. It's not necessarily the clearest cut definition, but you can acquire a developer and then let that developer sort of maintain some degree of independence. Maybe they keep their own name. Maybe they don't even exclusively use your own modules, but they could potentially be a throughput enabler for your panel business, particularly if things got really bad for your panel business. And so depending on how you define it, you could put a few different suppliers in that category. You could do the simplest thing, which is just sell modules, right? And then you're just in looking for projects that are not in the captive pipeline for which you can win. You have to be bankable, you have to compete on price. Potentially you have to compete on some other little value-added services. You can provide some development support. You can hope to bring along financing. You can coordinate financing for projects. There are a bunch of other ways that you can try to help out your customers to win those bids. But at its most basic, you're competing on bankability and price in those cases. You can JV or do some kind of a development partnership. This is a model that hasn't actually been tested out as much as I think it could be. There are some sort of semi-project developers that are out there whose entire business it is to basically partner up with module suppliers and say, look, give me some capital, give me panels at a pretty preferred price, and I'm going to go out and try to find some projects for you. That's a model that I think is starting to grow a bit. Or you can just out and out offer project finance. I put a few names on here, but this is more common than just those companies that I put there. I mean, this is becoming almost the stakes to enter the game. You have to be able to offer something in the way of project finance. Maybe it's just really extended terms on the modules so that you're basically offering construction finance. Maybe it's a little bit less intense than that, and it's just bringing along financing for the project with your preferred partners. Or maybe it is actually taking equity stakes in projects. And so there's a bunch of different models there. But if you talk to almost any supplier right now who's trying to access the utility market in the U.S., they've at least considered some kind of project finance. So we have just a couple minutes left here, so this is good timing. I'll close out my part of the conversation. So how big is this market going to be and when? This is our forecast for installations, utility installations, over the next few years. And it probably looks, if you just look at it, as like a nice up and to the right chart, which is easy to do with no meaning behind it. But this is our assessment. We take each individual project that's in the pipeline, we assess its viability, and then we calculate it based on that viability assessment. And this is what we think now. There are probably a couple things to point out individually on here. One is 2011. This is a dangerous call because we're 7 weeks out and we're not nearly at that number. It's 682 on the year. So in order for that to come true, and I'm crossing my fingers and knocking on wood here, a lot has to get connected in the next 6 or 7 weeks. So watch out for that. And then the next few years, this is a pretty sober view relative to the pipeline and the expectations for these projects. And there's a bunch of factors that can influence this. The coming potential expiration of 1603 might help, at least in the short term. You might see all these projects safe harbor and then have a bit of a motivation behind them to get done earlier. On the other hand, once you back up into a potentially tax equity bottleneck world, then financing for projects gets even more difficult. You also have, I have very little visibility into what debt terms are going to be 4 years down the line, and I think that's a big question mark for a lot of these projects. Panel prices we can project relatively well, or we can try, but debt's tougher. And besides that, we see growth year over year, but given the size of the pipeline, this is an assessment that basically says a good portion of contracted projects will not be completed, certainly not on time. And then, there's a separate question about contract renegotiation that I know we will tackle on the next panel. So that's generally our assessment. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions if there are any, and if I feel free to just argue with me if you want as well, and we'll get the first panel up here. Any questions? Please. Okay, so the question was, for anyone who didn't hear it, the first, there's two parts there. One is what proportion of the pipeline actually has a PPA, and then the second part is within those that have PPAs, what proportion is at a realistic price point. So the first part of that, what proportion has PPAs, that was that first slide that I presented. We have about 9 gigawatts in the pipeline with a PPA right now. These are projects that have not yet been completed. The second part of that is an extraordinarily difficult question, right? How much of that pipeline is viable? And it depends on a bunch of factors that we try to predict, but honestly, it's not that easy to do. You have to get component prices right. You have to get EPC prices right. I've been hearing just at this conference that these days the going turnkey system price is $2 for a utility scale system. That's lower than I thought it was. So, it's tough to get that right. They're low prices. There's no doubt about that in almost every one of these cases. There are some bilateral contracts that have been negotiated at higher prices. Like if you have a 14-cent PPA right now, that project's viable. There's no trouble getting that done. If you have a 6-cent PPA, it's tough to see. But I've been proven wrong before. As I said, panel prices fell 40% this year, and I didn't see that coming at the beginning of the year. So if that happens again, if something unforeseen happens and poly prices drop to $15 or something, which we don't expect, then you might see some more of these projects getting done. I think there's going to be a lot of frothiness in the market for the next few years, though. We will see projects getting flipped. We'll see some contracts renegotiated, some projects canceled or just sort of falling by the wayside. And maybe in the end, something like half of these projects get done. But that's that's pretty rough. Any other questions? Please, Eric.
Yeah, hi. I was at a solar event yesterday, and Ron Resch spoke, and he said that there was going to be 10 gigawatts of solar in the United States in 2015. And then at today's, the event I went to today, you're saying that there's, by the way, I work for Greentech Media. You're saying that there's about 3.5 gigawatts of utility solar in 2015, and so the delta there is 6.5 gigawatts. That's a lot of, obviously there's residential and commercial, but how much of a delta is there between yesterday's event and today's event?
Right, that must have been a great event. No, that's a good question. I guess there's 2 points I'd make there. The first is clarification, which is that Roan and SIA's goal, which is 10 gigawatts by 2015, is a great goal. It also includes CSP, which my forecast did not. So if you think that, and there are some CSP projects that are moving forward right now that will get done, so maybe not all of them, but some of them will. So that adds on some. There's also residential and commercial markets. That said, our overall forecast, baseline forecast, is below 10 gigawatts. But 10 gigawatts is SIA's goal. This is what they want to get to by 2015. I think that's actually a reasonable goal. I mean, the fact that our forecast doesn't call for that now is based on kind of the current situation. If we have a 1603 extension through 2016, I'm going to have to revise my forecasts, right? I mean, there are a number of things that could happen that could improve the characteristics of this market where we could get to that number. It's just in the sort of baseline scenario. I don't see us quite getting there by 2015. One last question here.
I was gonna quit- You said turnkey, $2 a watt. That was just for EPC and BOS, or was that the whole shooting?
No, I've been hearing that for the whole, $2 a watt, just to clarify. The numbers that I've been hearing bandied about, I've heard it a couple times past couple days, $2 a watt, all in. Modules, BOS, EPC. Maybe that's turnkey EPC without a developer margin, but that's low. And I will say, First Solar's cost roadmap, they publish that on their projects. It's cost, not price. They don't tack on the margin there, but they think they can get there next year. It's easy to imagine First Solar can do, a module for I don't know, 90 cents with a margin on there, or take it just at cost, right? 75 cents, 73 cents, plus $1.30, $1.25 for EPC. It's tight, but you could see how it could work. All right, with that, thank you, and let's invite the Visionary Roundtable up here. We can keep the discussion going.